Today on the podcast, we have a very special guest, Danielle Savory. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So glad to have you here. I'll tell you a little bit what I know about Danielle. I found her podcast about a year ago. She has a podcast called It's My Pleasure, which is the best name, by the way.
Thank you.
So good. And she is a sex coach for women. And I really love her podcast because she talks about all kinds of things, and sex is just part of it. And it's very normal. And it's good, I think, for people to talk about it. The other reason I really liked Danielle's podcast is she talks a lot about embodiment and allowing pleasure. So Danielle, how about if you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this work?
Yeah, I always love this question. Tell me a little bit about yourself, because it always comes out different, right? And also, like, depending on what we're talking about, because, knowing your podcast and that it's chronic pain and illness and all of that, like, that's a huge part of my journey and my background. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but that's actually what brought me to become a coach and into the work of embodiment and mindfulness. So my background's actually in neuroscience, and that's what, educationally kind of brought up in neuroscience. And then I also minored in Buddhist psychology. It was part of like my philosophy and a focus like on Buddhist, philosophy and their background. And so I learned this scientific thing and I learned like this mindfulness piece, but I never put the two together. I mostly just did the philosophy because it gave me something interesting to talk about at parties. And you can't really go in and like talk about all the neuroscience and organic chemistry and that sort of thing that I was learning. And so it was strictly because I really enjoyed it. Like, that's what lit me up. I loved talking about it. I loved learning about it. And then it wasn't till later when I had my chronic pain and I was bedridden for 2 years and everything just kind of felt like it was like caving in on me, that I revisited my mindfulness sort of teachings, but now it wasn't from this place of like understanding and learning and this cognitive understanding, but I started to practice it. And I really started to practice meditation, practice mindfulness, practice all these embodiment sort of techniques to be able to help me out of like the darkest place I had ever been in my life. And for me to understand it and for me to really grasp it, it was so helpful for me to bring in the neuroscience. So at that time, like, now it's mainstream, but you have to understand, like, that's only really recently that it's more mainstream, talking about meditation, talking about mindfulness. When I was going through my stuff, which was over 10 years ago, it wasn't mainstream. I live in Portland, Oregon, so we're very liberal here. So there's a lot of people that talk about meditation, but the way they speak about it was a language that I didn't really resonate with. It was a little bit more on the woo-woo and it felt kind of hippie. And even though like my best friend was very into that and I loved her to death, I had a hard time getting over my like mental judgment of that type of language. And so I had to go to my neuroscience books and help myself understand. And this is at the same time that neuroscientists and neuropsychologists were actually bringing meditation and mindfulness into the laboratory, and they started studying it. So at this time, I was starting to really reach out and find these other teachers and mentors like Richie Davis and Rick Hansen and all of these people that started to bring the science into mindfulness and meditation. And this is before they even started writing books, but I could find their studies or their articles in these more harder to reach sort of places. I would fly to California so that I could like attend their lectures. This is where everything really began for me to put the two together in my own brain, because I was noticing the effects in my body. And then I was like, I have to talk about this. I want to teach it. And so I started teaching in circles, and then I became a coach. And then that led into doing it more just specifically on sex coaching and pleasure, because I think it's such a missing piece in so many different ways. And I really loved what I was finding in my own studies and in my own research, the link between not just the mindfulness and the meditation and how that helped me so much, but also in the brain science behind sex.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. There was so much there. And I don't know if I'm sure people would love to hear, if you want to share a little bit more about your chronic pain and kind of you said you were bedridden for 2 years.
Yeah.
So my
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically what happened was, I think it happens with a lot of people with chronic pain. You're looking for issues, or excuse me, you're looking for answers, right? You're looking for like, why do I have this? What's going on? All of this sort of thing. So when things really started to switch for me, and looking back, there was like these little indicators, even in high school and in college, of just like my body starting to fail me or just kind of falling apart. And these longer periods of time where I was just experiencing a lot of pain. And then it kind of all came to a head. So I was doing a job that I didn't like. I had recently quit. I was wanting to be a brain surgeon, and I decided I didn't want to be a brain surgeon. And so I quit on that path, and I was like, okay, I'm not doing that. I know that it's not that. And one of the things that I realized was how much I had been doing things, I don't want to say just out of validation or people pleasing, but there was just this high achiever in me that just kept going, where I never really paused and was like, is this what I want to do? Is this the kind of thing that lights me up? And I just had this spark of clarity when my husband and we were living with my parents. This was before we were married. We were living with my parents. I just gotten back from England, just did this neuroscience program over there. And I looked at him and I was like, I don't want to do this. I want to go hiking. I want to be in the woods. I want to be with him. Who am I doing this for? And I realized I was doing it for the quote unquote them, out there, not really
who
for
are they?
me.
Yeah.
Who are they? I don't even know. Proving myself to the world, proving my worth as a woman, that I'm smart. I don't know. There's so many layers to that, right. But it wasn't for me. So I quit, and then I was doing this job, and that's when stuff started just kind of picking up. And then I got in a car accident, and it was low back pain. And then the low back pain wasn't really there. It was all over pain. And it was, what they were saying then was fibromyalgia, but we were also looking at, thyroid stuff. We were looking at, Hashimoto's, lupus, MS, all the things, because people don't know really why we have pain in our body. And so there was, we finally really landed on fibromyalgia, but there was still MS stuff, because I couldn't, I would lose feeling in my hands, from kind of my elbows up to my fingers, where I couldn't use my hands. I couldn't grip. It was hard to grab soap or wash my hair. So it was more my activities of daily living got to the point where getting out of bed could be really hard on some days. And I was able to, it wasn't like I just laid in bed and was horizontal all day, every day. I was able to get up, and some good days I'd be able to shower and make food and do all of that, but I couldn't have a job. I couldn't do most, activities of daily living. Sometimes I'd have to see if my acupuncturist could come over to my house, because I couldn't grip a steering wheel. I couldn't drive. And it was really hard. It was a really dark period. And when I started to do mindfulness and meditation, when I met myself, I would go to yoga, and luckily there was a studio near me, so I could walk there, and I would get to this yoga class. And the teacher there, because I told her about how much pain I was in and I could barely move, she's like, it's okay if you just lay and just follow your breath and imagine yourself doing the poses and the things that I'm talking about, even if you just lay horizontal. And so for the first few weeks, maybe in the first few months, I didn't really even do quote unquote the yoga. I just laid on my mat and I listened to her words, and I'd imagine myself in my body doing the things that my body wasn't quite there to do. And I found my breath. And that's when I really noticed my inner voice. And
fantastic.
Yeah. And my criticism and all of that. And that's when things totally switched, as you know.
Yeah. So did you find life coaching around that time too?
No, I didn't find life coaching till later. Yeah. This was just oh, wow. Of course I feel this awful in my body. I'm literally living with the enemy. And when you start to understand the impact that inner talk can have, and your inner critic, and the way that you're speaking to yourself and treating yourself, and you start to like really become aware of this other voice, it's like, how could I not feel like this? Like, of course I feel horrible, because like I'm literally attacking myself, and then your nervous system and everything that happens that creates more tension, and it creates more inflammation, and it creates all these things in the body. And I had no idea that was happening.
Yeah, I remember the exact same experience the first time I really journaled and let it all out. And my first reaction was to be super critical of myself because of how critical I was of myself. But I did
Of
think,
course.
no wonder I'm in so much pain. No wonder I'm not happy. No wonder I feel horrible. Like the thoughts in my head about myself were so horrible. And I think a lot of times we kind of, when our body is, failing us, or it becomes the enemy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like disembody.
Yeah, totally. It's like and I think that was one of the hardest things to reconcile during that time too, was I'm like, I don't know how to change my inner voice, because right now I literally hate my body. My body is failing me. It's keeping me back from doing anything. I was also struggling with fertility at this time. So I was like, I can't even get pregnant. I can't even shower some days. I can't even do any of this. Like, why would I be kind to myself? I literally hate my body.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, there's this gap of like, how do you get to even having that better inner voice? How do you even stop the inner critic? So mindfulness helped.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the first step is awareness, right? Yes. So it's like the first step is like just being aware that that voice was happening. And, then I was like, okay, so then you are aware of that voice is happening. And for me, being the science nerd that I am, like, it's like, okay, what's going on when we actually speak to ourselves this way? What is the impact of speaking to myself? Not just that I feel awful and I feel diminished and I feel all of these things, but more to like the level of pain and tension and inflammation, and understanding the stress cycle and understanding the pain cycle and all of these kind of things. When you really start to understand that, you're like, oh wait, this is actually key. Like the way that I speak to myself is actually essential. And from that point, I really started to learn not just to have that awareness and that mindfulness, but how to start incorporating practices of self-compassion. And there's a book that I highly recommend. It's called SelfCompassion with Kristen Neff. I'm not sure if you've mentioned that on this podcast before.
I haven't mentioned it on the podcast, but she is like who you always hear for self-compassion. She's the gold standard.
Yes. Yeah. So back in the day, I actually trained with her while she was still doing personal trainings. And she was the first person. Yeah. Super cool. She was the first person to really take self-compassion and bring it into the science world, because it hadn't been quantified before. And so she was able to bring it so we could start studying it, because back then, or not back, but like, just 90s, early 2000s, all of that, like the focus was on self-esteem. And so she started bringing her own meditation practices into noticing the impacts of self-compassion, and then figuring out a system like how to actually teach people self-compassion versus self-esteem, and then started to quantify that so she could take people that were practicing self-compassion into the laboratory and see the impacts. And that's when everything started changing. That's when things really were be able to get more mainstream. And so self-compassion was huge for me. Like I was like, wait a minute, I can accept my human emotions. Like I can accept that I don't feel good. I can be nice to myself. Like it was so foreign, and it was such a struggle for me at the beginning, because it's just not really how we're socialized. And it's such a totally different skill than we've ever been taught. And that's when everything really started flipping for me in my experience of my own body.
Yeah, I think so many people think with self-compassion, if I start to feel compassionate towards myself, then I'm just going to, never care about anything. They go to the extreme, right? Like if I'm not constantly beating myself up, then I'm going to be good for nothing, completely worthless. And I do try to teach people about how your self-worth is independent of that. But a lot of people with chronic pain do have a history of being high achievers.
Yep.
People who are always pushing themselves, perfectionists, people pleasers.
Yep. All of it. Yeah. And so it becomes this thing where like, wait a minute, like, am I going to lose myself? Am I not going to be able to achieve? Am I not going to be able to get goals? Is my house going to be a mess? Is my body going to be a mess? It's like all the worries that come in with like the idea that being nice to myself, I'm going to completely lose control and unravel. And it's simply not the case. And again, that's why I think like Kristen Neff's, her studies are so important because they've shown actually the exact opposite, and when we really start to pay attention to, even with our children, and noticing like how our children respond to, let's say, like a coach that's constantly being harsh and yelling at them and you're not good enough and you're blah, 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 and what's the matter with you, versus the children who have a coach that are like, okay, you did your best. Let's go ahead and give it a try next time. Like that didn't turn out exactly how you want. You can see the ones that thrive and the ones that just like whittle and end up quitting and all of that. So all of the studies really do support, like there's no study that supports the fact that being harsh on yourself and being unkind actually moves you forward.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's good to just remember, like, this is not just someone's theory. You don't have to take someone's word for it.
Yeah.
This is science.
Yeah.
And it actually helps with healing too.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The environment that you're in, you're creating these neurochemicals by your thoughts, and then neurochemicals are entering your bloodstream. And if it's cortisol, and you have that prolonged amounts of time, you are going to have more inflammation.
Yep.
It's going to aggravate everything.
It aggravates everything. It makes everything exasperated and worse. And the tension, the inflammation, like it just, you get into these cycles, and then the way that your body's feeling re-triggers that cycle into your brain. I'm under attack, I'm threatened here. And it's hard to get out of. And so when you start to not just speak more kindly to yourself, but begin to allow yourself to like have this pain and have compassion around it, that's when everything starts changing. And like, that's also, that combination of not just speaking kindly to yourself, but like you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, really becoming embodied, really dropping into your body and meeting it.
Yeah, for sure. I have people, close their eyes and just imagine going into their body and describing what their sensations are. And it's foreign to a lot of people. They've never done it. They don't think sometimes they can even do it. But the more we do it, the easier it gets, right?
Yeah, totally. That? Yeah, it was very foreign. I think it's foreign for everybody at the beginning. It's really tricky to get into your body because we're not taught and we're disconnected. And, I think I find it even more with women. We're very disconnected from our bodies for a number of reasons, and the way that we've been socialized to kind of like put on a grin and, smile and do it anyway, and not encouraged to tap into our own desires and what we really want, but more of like what our family or our husbands or our children or, society wants from us in general, that we kind of have to shove it down. And the more that we shove it down, the more we just ignore that those are even there, and we disconnect. And so learning how to reconnect with your body, even, a lot of times that's because why we are in chronic pain, because we've been shoving it down for so many years. So it's like we have to reintroduce this like connection and relationship that's like trusting and loving and safe with our body again. And then we can meet the discomfort, then we can meet the pain within the body.
So did you find any other techniques helpful? Definitely monitoring your mind is always a good first step. Learning about the self-compassion. Were there any other things you found helpful for yourself?
Yeah, like a million things.
A million things. And the journey,
No, yeah,
it's individual.
it's such a journey. Yeah.
Everyone.
One like just really easy, obvious one for me was nature. Just there was this connection that I had with nature that allowed me to do those things easier. So I ended up, really my path to recovery was through walking and through hiking. And I noticed when I was in nature that I was able to just kind of, it sounds woo woo, but almost like absorb like the vastness and the bigness of the nature, where it made my pain feel smaller and it made me just connect in a bigger way. So that was one of the things. Another thing was like just during this embodied practice. And one of the things I talk about with my clients who have pain in their body and they're trying to have pleasure and have better sex is understanding that sometimes it feels like it's everywhere. Sometimes the pain feels like it's just this all-encompassing experience. And that is the way that our brain has learned to approach pain, because to the brain, it is the most important thing to pay attention to is our pain, because our pain is signaling to us there's something wrong. So we better pay attention to it. So this, by default, by the way the brain works, is going to exasperate the pain. So it's like really trying to get our attention. Like, are you paying attention here? Like there's something wrong. There's something really wrong. And so learning, like as you go into the embodiment and you start to pay attention, and like you said, like, where is it? And what am I noticing? One of the things I found was really, really helpful was and this is what I help my clients with too, is like tracing, like if you were going to find the border of it and take a Sharpie marker and you kind of draw around exactly where the pain is, and then you stay with that border, and then you keep staying with that border. And what you notice over time is like, it actually isn't as big as you thought. And then maybe all of a sudden it goes from your low back to like your elbow to your chest, and you'll just notice it like moving around. And that realization, when you start to pay attention to that, you realize there's the rest of your whole body that isn't hurting, that might be neutral, and it has an opportunity to actually feel good. And you might notice pleasure alongside the pain. You'll notice your nourishing breath alongside of the pain. And when you start to realize like, the pain isn't the only thing in existence right now. This is not the only, it's not like you're just a pain person. You are a person who is experiencing pain in this one particular area. And just even that kind of language allowed me to open up to all this other stuff. And when you start to see the rest of your body is there to support the pain and hold the pain in a compassionate way, that would help the pain move through. And over time, it really helped eliminate it, to be honest. And so that was a huge part of it. And then, because I help women with pleasure, like connecting with pleasure and really soaking in the good of pleasure and marinating in it. And because our brain has a natural negativity bias and it's looking for the pain, again, coming back to pleasure and not just noticing it, but like feeling like you're soaking it in, like it's becoming a part of you, becoming a part of your brain, becoming a part of your whole being. And over time, what that does is it almost creates a buffer system. It creates a buffer system of resilience and, a nourishing like refuge within your body to help yourself through the pain.
Yeah, that is so important. A lot of times people want to fight their pain or push it away, and we do focus on it a lot when we have it. And it feels almost unsafe not to focus on it, I think, to our brain sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
And the pleasure, for sure, there's the sexual pleasure, which is so important. And, as human beings, sexuality is part of our energy, I think, part of what makes us a whole being.
Yeah.
And there's other kinds of pleasure too, that is they're there, things that we'd take for granted probably, right? Simple
Mm-hmm.
things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's both, and working into sexual pleasure. Sometimes we can't even just jump straight into sexual pleasure. It's learning how to receive pleasure in general, from daily pleasures, in the senses. And one of the things that I really emphasize and talk with my clients is sensuality is just paying attention to the senses. And when you learn how to do that, then it's easier then to translate that to your own sexual pleasure, right? But it's learning how to be with pleasure and pleasurable sensations in general to work up to more of the sexual pleasure, where there tends to be a lot more blocks, mental blocks there, but you've now practiced like learning to, engage with pleasure in your body.
Yeah. And receive pleasure, even receiving just in general is such a
Mm-hmm.
hard thing for us
Yeah.
sometimes in
Yeah.
our society,
Yeah.
especially this time of year. We're about to go into Christmas, and giving is so much easier and more natural for most of us than
Yeah.
receiving. It's
Yes, for
almost like
sure.
we think it is a weakness to receive, where it's really a strength.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. You're
And
flipping the whole narrative.
yeah, you really are.
Yeah.
And do you ever find that it just gets out of control with some people? They just turn into complete hedonists, and they're out of control once they start allowing
No.
pleasure.
No,
Phew,
never.
I hoped
Yeah.
you would say that.
No, it's funny that you bring that up, because that is actually, it is a fear and a trepidation that comes with a lot of the women that I work with. They're like, oh, I'm afraid, then I'm going to be like a slut, or I'm going to be like just walking around, just like wanting sex all the time from all these like people. And what if my partner can't fulfill it? Then am I going to be a cheat? And I'm like, okay, this is,
Yeah. Come on, brain.
no, yes, like it's just your brain's way of being like, don't change. Let's come up with this, scenario where things go very, very much to the extreme. And it's really just our fear of losing control, right? That all of a sudden we're going to tap into this pleasure in our body, and that pleasure is going to lead the way. And it's the way that we've learned about pleasure. It's the way that we've learned about sexuality, and thinking that it's like this something that's like a drive. Like I hate when people say sex drive, because it's really not a drive, and thinking that we have no control over it. It's just like this animal instinct that just takes over our body, and there's nothing that we have to say about it. And that's not how it is. And it's not what the women that I work with experience.
Yeah. Are there any other common misconceptions that you see with generally the women that you work with?
Oh, I mean, we could talk for 8 hours.
So many.
I mean, it's like all
Yeah.
misconceptions. That's why we're in this position to begin with as women, is like we have all the misconceptions about what sex means, what it means for us, all of these things. And that's creating us our block to be able to connect, with pleasure, of like what it should look like. And when we are worried about what it should look like because of what we've been exposed to in the media, in our families, and everything else, then these all become misconceptions, because they're not actually based in reality and how the body works and all of that. So yes, I would say there's a million misconceptions. But yeah, I think one of those, that's a big one, is the fear. The other one I would say is just that, like, I would say where it comes to like men and women, like that men have this high sex drive that they can't control, and that they need it. It's like an actual physical need. That's just BS. They might think that way, but a lot of that is the way that we've socialized men too.
Oh yeah, true. Right?
Yeah.
We can't tease that apart. We just don't know.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is what I teach people too, is that this journey is very individualized for you.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, anytime we have expectations of things being a certain way, that can lead to disappointment. So yeah, just realizing this journey is about you and what you really want from life, what you need.
And I think it's like the difference. I think sometimes we talk about like what we need, and I think that becomes like a catch-all too sometimes, because especially with women, we can really convince ourselves we don't need a lot, right? And so it's more even leaning into like, what do I want? Like, what is my desired result or my desired outcome? And what's going to like be of service to me to be able to get there, rather than getting caught in this phrase of like, what is it that I need? Because that becomes, especially the way that we're socialized, can become even just a heavy question, right? Because when you're asking for help, like when you have chronic pain and you're asking for support or asking for help and you're asking the question, well, what do I need? It's like, well, your brain can come up with a ton of reasons that you don't actually need help. You don't actually need support, that you could